to raise the hand.
Okay, okay. And I keep hearing, maybe it's just an age thing, I keep hearing bells ringing, although they seem to have stopped. So
Every time someone new joins us, the bell rings.
Yeah, so actually I'm going to turn off that function.
Apparently not. Okay.
Okay, let's get rolling. So I'm delighted to welcome everyone into this interesting session, and I appreciate all those that are delivering remarks. And we're going to proceed along the program as it was listed. And what we're going to do is have each presentation go about 15 minutes and then allow questions, a few questions of the presenter. And then hopefully if everyone keeps to their time, and I'll harass you if you don't, that'll also allow us some extra time at the end of the session, which is scheduled to end on East Coast time at 6:45, an hour and a half from now. Presenters, don't be upset if I interrupt you if you're going on way beyond 15 minutes, just because I want to allow some more time for questions. And I'm happy to introduce the first speaker is John Godard from University of Manitoba, who's going to talk about a focus with a question mark about whether it's new industrial relations on democratic principles at work. Welcome, John.
John, could you please unmute yourself?
Mute.
Perfect. Now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, let's just see that just a minute here. I've got forgot to close one of my words. I'm just going to do the share screen. Hope I get the right one. That looks like it. Okay. This is a paper I've been working on. I really got the impetus for it when I was in lockdown during the COVID crisis. And so much of what I've written here kind of reflects the angst that I was undergoing. We'd come back from California, so we were locked away and so on and so forth. And I've changed the name to Employment for the Human Race. And any of you that have been around for a while know that that's a takeoff on John Budd's book, Employment with a Human Face. And I'll get to why that is later. I just thought it was clever. New agenda for an old field. Basically, I start off with this quote, and it's a lead quote in the paper, and it's a quote from someone named Eric Olin Wright. If I could get the thing on the right-hand side here out, maybe I can do that. Good. It's from a paper by Eric Olin Wright, who I'm going to be drawing on his work in this paper, so that's why I start with this quote. But essentially, I mean, hello, what else is new? Trying to establish a core purpose and intellectual framework for IR. And I'm arguing essentially for a post-materialist approach and research agenda that it kind of addresses what Wright's getting at. And I do so in 8 stages. I start off with the kind of the obligatory critique of the field. I love this quote, though. I discovered it while writing the paper, and I have no idea how I discovered it. It's from an album by Harry Nilsson. For any of the oldsters that are here will know who Harry Nilsson was. But he had this mythical album where there was a pointed forest, and I don't know, all of this. And you come up with the quote, which apparently he came up with when he was under the influence of acid. A point in every direction is the same as no point at all. And I think that describes the field reasonably well. A lot of research has a point to it. It's not a mountain of facts anymore, as Dunlop characterized it in the 1950s. There are a lot of research programs and a lot of points, but when you add them up together, you get a field that has no point. It really doesn't have a unifying point or really intellectual foundation or identity anymore. Personally, I like to argue and debate, and so I find it excessively polite and kind of sanitized. Like the word labor, you're not allowed to use even industrial anymore in some circles. It's just employment relations. Why is this? There are many reasons to it. This is kind of the post-war contractualism that the field bought into, especially in North America. And the argument is IR may in fact have served as a servant of power, helping to shore up a system which we now see as having possibly pernicious effects. But I also argue that IR has been constrained by kind of ideological and, more important, academic and epistemological constraints as to how research should be done, and kind of, this is especially so in business schools, but I think in general. So these are contentious arguments, which I hope are argued with a little bit more nuance in the paper. But there are these prospects for a new IR, in question marks, finally, or quotes or brackets. First of all, we're at, and I couldn't think of a less fashionable term, a historical juncture. We've got all of this literature going on about changes to work and employment and how these are going to accelerate in the near future. I think too much of this is hype, but when you add it all up, it matters. It does suggest that kind of the post-war model has had its day. The COVID crisis, of course, makes this a particularly opportune moment to try and change what we argue and think about work and employment. And of course, the environmental crisis, which I think the post-war model feeds into. I mean, it was a model of materialism and consumerism, which is at the heart of much of the environmental crisis. So we need an alternative, and I use the term post-material conception of the nature and purpose of work and employment. And I'm going through fairly fast here because I think I have too much on this presentation. But I think IR is particularly well suited. Although it's often not stated, I think it's fair to say that most people, or a great many of people in the field, have really underneath what they're doing had been driven by a concern for the quality and conditions of employment. And we've also got a strong institutional tradition, which makes us better placed to talk about reconfiguring institutions and organizations. But the field needs to be emancipated from its constraints. It needs to move beyond the kind of traditional focus on economic issues and outcomes, and it needs to become more explicitly normative. In other words, have an explicit point to it. And so to emancipate IR, I looked at a couple of authors, and one is Amitai Etzioni, and I'll just skip over it for reasons of time. And the other is, again, coming back to Eric Olin Wright, who recently died, and I actually read this not in his work, but in a tribute to him by Michael Burawoy. It's something called the Real Utopias Project, where it was explicitly normative. And I should back up and say Eric Olin Wright was the leading class theorist in the last couple of decades of the 20th century, and the president of the ASA, I think in around 2010. So this guy is not a lightweight. He argues specifically for the pursuit of democratic ideals, but he also argues for, that's the utopia, but the real part is the search for real forms that foster their attainment. Part of the problem I have with his approach is that he's focusing on alternatives to capitalist forms of organization and institution, which I think limits them too much. And he proceeds from the belief that these ideals cannot be achieved within capitalism, which I think also is too limiting. So my approach is really, we want to follow, I'd like to follow his lead, but identify a more employment specific and clearly specified set of principles. I want an approach that views these as highly variable rather than kind of abstract categories. Looks at how they can be achieved within capitalism as well as beyond it, however we define capitalism, and builds on, and this is kind of the foundation to it, is assumes my approach, a universal basic income, benefits, pensions, etc., which of course we don't yet have, but I don't think these are issues we need to research. I think they're issues we need to advocate for, and so that's almost outside of what I'm envisioning here, but certainly these are foundational to it. So I identify 9 principles. It's relatively arbitrary, but all of these can be traced to philosophy or various conventions and charters of human rights, and I think have good founding in the literature. We actually had these as quote unquote dependent variables in an article in 2014. And you can kind of go down there. I mean, this is, you know, motherhood and apple pie, really. I I believe that these are principles that should be central to our work explicitly. I think that they have implications for other outcomes, but I think they should be core, if you will, independent variables. Although I'm not arguing that this requires quantitative research, it can be qualitative as well. So what about equity versus efficiency? One of the critiques you would have here is, well, whatever happened to the economy? I have a problem with the equity versus efficiency paradigm, and I have had for a long time. The term efficiency is completely misleading to me. It masks the real issue, which has been essentially returns to capital. That depends on technical efficiency, but it also depends on how well employers are able to exploit human resources. And I think these should not have equal status. I think that they should be seen as constraints or possibly facilitators of the attainment of the democratic principles. And I also have a problem with equity, which I deal with more in the paper. It's just typically ill-defined and very limited in its scope. So this is kind of why I come out with this phrase, employment for the human race, rather than for employment with a human face. And I have a bunch of propositions. How much time do I have left? Hello?
You have 5 more minutes.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, so I have a series of propositions based in the new institutionalism, and of course citing myself and other work I've done with Corolla Frege. But I essentially assume that IR is, my definition of IR now, and it may be a dated one, is ultimately the relation about the relations between labor and capital as they are played out in the workplace and beyond, even though these relations may be highly obscured and increasingly so in the contemporary economy. And these relations are ultimately, in how they're played out, are ultimately essential to how well democratic ideals are attained. Institutional environments are critical to how these relations work and how they're played out. So institutional environments are especially critical through their implications for the distribution of power and the exercise of management authority. And I put on a bit of a comparative hat there, where if you compare Japan to Germany to the US, these relations are played out extremely differently and largely reflect differences in the institutional environment. The study I did with Corolla Frege looked at the differences in the attainment of these ideals in Germany versus the USA. And actually, we didn't find very strong results, but I'll pretend I didn't say that. And of course, institutional environments allow for considerable variation. I'm not arguing that everything's attributable to them. But I'll just skip through there without going through all the principles, and just, I then identify this research agenda, where I talk about descriptive analysis, multivariate analysis, hermeneutic research, ideographic research, historical institutional comparative analysis, experimental research, business school in a lab type research, which I've actually did some years ago, but it's one approach. And of course, experimental research number 2, which is the kind of thing actually that the crimped sessions at these meetings is I think looking at, although I'm not sure that it addresses these democratic principles expressly. Exemplar research, where you look at the Mondragon system, Israeli Kibbutzim, the Pacific Coast Plywood Cooperatives, Robert Owen's Newlander, medieval trade guilds. You can look at a whole host of things, not just as exemplars, but to explore what went wrong and how what went wrong might be addressed. Critical theory and research. You start reading Marcuse and Bourdieu and these people, and all of the above kind of gets blown out the window, but it's certainly worth looking at. And finally, this kind of general philosophy and deep theory about kind of the meaning of life and where these principles come from and how they might be served. So there are a bunch of questions that arise from what I'm doing here. There are misgivings that I have, but I don't know how I can fully address them. One is, how do we get from here to there, despite our so-called historical juncture? And I cite a number of kind of different arguments. I mean, John Kelly would say you need to mobilize to transform institutions. Habermas would say you need to kind of cut through this distorted communication and the biases it entails. Eric Olin Wright surprisingly didn't argue for like revolution or transformation. His main argument was taming or eroding or escaping capitalism with various organizational alternatives. IR folks, of course, would be incrementalist. Managerialists would, of course, be exhorting the CSR people. And then, of course, lawyers would be legal institutional reforms. But how do labor unions and collective bargaining figure into this? That's a problem with it. I think, though, for achieving these outcomes, more whether in terms of the changes necessary to achieve them, but their role in directly achieving them in the workplace is an empirical question. I could tell you that the union where I work doesn't achieve any of them. It's largely dead at this point. So the assumption that a union automatically leads to the attainment of these ideals is, I think, something worth investigating. What about the material conditions of employment, the content of collective agreements? Am I just advocating a return to the QWL movement of the 70s? Hope not, but Harry Arthurs gave a presentation at CIRA maybe 10 years ago where he said it's all really just about power. I think that's not an entirely oversimplified argument. And finally, the one at the bottom is who really cares, and that's the one I can't answer. These are all issues that I have with what I'm proposing, and it's still something in progress. But at root, I think we need to do something different. I think the time is right for it. I think that we can accumulate theory and knowledge that allows for the some sort of reasonable transformation in work and employment. Neoliberal globalization, to me, is on its way out. Let's hope I'm right. So this is the time to be refocusing, to kind of forget about the post-war model of not just industrial relations, but also of research, and go beyond it and have this kind of explicitly normative objective in what we're trying to accomplish, and then go out and study how it gets achieved. So that's basically it.
Thanks, John. So what I'm going to do is allow, if there are one or two short questions, but not give John or subsequent presenters the opportunity to respond to those questions until we finish up, because I want to make sure everyone else gets their full shot at presenting. But if you have one or two questions you want to ask right away, let Natalia know, and we'll move on from there. Natalia, is there anyone asking a question? I haven't seen anything come across my screen.
I haven't seen anything come up across my screen
Okay.
either, but if anyone's having trouble raising their hands or accessing the access box, just unmute yourself. You can unmute yourself
Okay.
right now. Say your name and then I'll write it down and then we can move along.
Can I ask a quick one?
Sure.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Al.
John, I'd like to know what you think about your normative ideals in comparison with the ILO's concept of decent work.
Okay, now again, John, I'm not letting you answer. I'm not going to let the answers come until the end, because I want to make sure everybody has a full shot to present. But it's a good start. Anna had a good question. Let's hold it. Let me then move on to the next presentation. Is to be made by Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld from Brandeis University, and Anna Booth, who just spoke, who's kindly with us from the Fair Works Commission. It's based in Australia. And I want to mention they're going to talk about institutionalization of efforts at promoting problem solving and integrative solutions at the workplace. And their work has been done with Johanna Macneil and Mark Bray, both of whom I saw have been participating. Johanna has been at Newcastle and is about to move on, and I don't remember the full name, so I won't say it, of the institution she's moving to. And then Mark is still based in Newcastle. And so I'll turn it over to Joel and Anna. Thanks.
Anna, you're muted.
Do that. Just about to do that, Joel. And Joel's going to share the screen. And while he's doing that, I'm going to fill the space by saying hi to everyone. Good evening, good morning for myself, Johanna, and Mark, and if there's anybody else from Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge that wherever we are in the world, we're meeting on the land of traditional owners. And I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And Joel is going to do the same, I believe, in respect to his lands.
Yeah, I'm on the traditional lands of the Newton and Waltham and the Nipmuc and Massachusetts people. I too pay respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Well, I appreciate the chance to follow John's remarks, presenting a broad theory framework and, in a sense, a search for theory in a post-industrial world. We're going to begin with theory, go to practice, and come back to theory in a couple of different ways. I'll start by saying that I had a rare opportunity to collaborate with a fellow that some of you will know, Joe Isaac, sadly, who passed not too long ago at the age of 96. And he literally was part of over 50 years of industrial relations policy in Australia. But we took a look at 100 years of legislation, beginning with the 1904 Act, which was with the object of preventing lockouts and strikes. And we tried to classify literally dozens of different twists and turns in the policies as to whether they were oriented, whether the object of the act was to create value or to mitigate harm. And the broad conclusion was that in most cases, new legislative initiatives were oriented around preventing harm, preventing bad things from happening. And then only later did subsequent legislation also try to figure out how to add value, expand the pie, or what have you. And although there were a couple of different ventures along those lines all throughout the history, what's going to be most important for the remarks that Anne and I will share with you is a 2013 amendment to the Act, which asked the Fair Work Commission to promote cooperative and productive workplaces in the nation. Now, this was not an insignificant undertaking for a judicial body oriented towards resolving disputes. We'll say more about what that took, but I just want to lift up first the fact that not only did the commission get a charge to promote cooperative and productive workplaces, but it embarked on a process, I should say, of training and development, and ultimately institutionalization of the effort. Anna, you might say a word about the fact that there's now Form F79.
Yeah. I think something I should say for those who aren't familiar with Australia is that the Fair Work Commission, although it sounds a little bit like a think tank or a normative body in John's terms, it's actually Australia's National Workplace Relations Tribunal. So it has its, I guess in Canada, you have an industrial relations, I believe, tribunal at a national level. It's like that. So it's the story of the extension and reinvention in many ways of that tribunal that Joel and I are wanting to tell in our now, I guess, about 12 minutes left. But the F79 is kind of a bureaucratic artifact. It's a form that you have to fill in if you're an employer and a group of employees, either represented by a union or another group that's identifiable and clearly collective with a mandate. It initiates a file in the Fair Work Commission to start a process of support for those parties in transforming their relationships and their model of engagement. But what's interesting about it is it kind of creates that institutional legitimacy or recognition of the program.
Super. And so what that means is we have a commission, 100-year history over that, which has a long history of conciliation and arbitration, setting national minimum wages, resolving collective disputes, making awards at the industry or sector level, resolving individual disputes. And as Anna will tell you, the conciliation is not a kind of kind mediation in a polite way. It's more of a, urging parties to go forward in a more directive way to resolve disputes. And I contrast that here with what this new 2013 object requires, which is the same commissioners and the same professional staff now suddenly have a remit to do enterprise bargaining that's more problem solving, to do relationship building, to do dispute resolution, to facilitate organizational change. In parallel, but not unrelated, is national anti-bullying legislation. So it's really something of a culture change to go from an adjudicatory role to this role. And I had the privilege, as we'll say later, of working with many of the commissioners. Anna has the remit to, as the deputy president, to lead this effort on behalf of the organization. And Anna's probably too polite to say this, but I would say that there's about a third of the commissioners that are enthusiastically driving this, a third that are taking some cases and doing some of the work. And there are some that say, I just want to wear my robe, sit in my bench, and have people come to my chambers and let me pronounce judgments. So
and I won't disagree with that, Joel, but I'll leave it at that.
Indeed. I once got in the elevator with a whole group of University Sydney mid-career professionals that we were training, and we happened to have this wonderful session with Anna in her chambers as we talked about this new approaches. And then we got in the elevator with one of the members who said, oh, I don't do that new approaches stuff. I mean, she literally put herself into that other third, which for the participants who were so enthusiastic about what they heard, that was a dose of reality. But what we're asking these commissioners to do, and what we're asking the parties to then do with the adjudicatory body, is to really adopt an interest-based process where they surface interest, they share information, they generate options, they develop criteria, they work towards consensus. There is hard bargaining, but it's really more problem solving in its orientation. And if we go to the Kochen, Katz, and McCursey model, it's literally going beyond the strategic level with industry awards to enterprise level bargaining using an interest-based approach, as well as workplace level participation and transformation, and then bumping up to sector and strategic level, not just enterprise, but at a national level, really seeking the kind of alignment that might be a transformation. So as a national experiment, this is quite a bold experiment. To best understand it, it might be helpful to have a few cases. Anna?
Thank you, Joel. Joel and I felt that we could best bring this to life by just giving you a couple of cases, and no surprises that I'm going to choose two that I regard as successful, but I want to acknowledge that there have been many that have not been. The title of our paper is Swimming Against the Tide, and our dear friends and colleagues, Johanna, Macneil and Bray, who are listening also to us, have actually been instrumental, as you will see from the source on this slide, in chronicling our progress in not only this particular case study that they prepared, but also in a book called Cooperation at Work. And the successful cases that I'm going to provide to you are themselves an indication of how it is that the institution has transformed, which is the story that we'd like to tell. It's partly a pull process where parties demonstrably request and desire the services of members of the Commission to be performed differently, quite radically differently actually, from the usual adjudication, sitting on the bench, not quite with robes on, Joel, because we're a tribunal, not a court, but, you know, metaphorically, that's a good description. Right through to the interventions that Joel described of training and facilitation. And this particular story of the Opal Fibre Packaging Company and the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union is one, as you can see from the quote, from the Group General Manager back in 2014, a serious competitive crisis, a large company with plants all over Australia that was literally on the brink of its board deciding this is part of a global entity. It wasn't part of the Opal entity then, it was a different owner, but it was a global board decision to potentially close all of the manufacturing sites across Australia, and that was recognised. You'll see in the other quote we use, well, that's really serious. And so those parties decided to work together in a completely different way, unprecedented for them and for many of the traditional engagements between employers and unions in Australia. And they were working on the very survival of the organisation. And to this day, so that's 6 years ago now, to this day, they have what they call site change teams in each workplace and other groups where they conduct dialogue. And that dialogue is not a superstructure that is placed on top of the ordinary workings of the organisation. It actually is how those workplaces work. And having that in our institution as an example has actually brought many of the members of the commission, and after all, an institution, some of the theorists might tell me different, but I think an institution is the sum of the individuals within it, both the memories and the legacies as well as the present. But they've been inspired by that work and have then taken it up, and we've used the experiences we've had in one place to apply to others. And Joel's sharing the next slide, which is a completely different kind of business. Did I say, I apologise if I didn't, that the Opal business is a manufacturing business that produces cardboard boxes. So at one level, a very simple manufacturing process, but a very important one in the supply chain of a country that both has at least some manufacturing left, but certainly packages up and posts, as we have all been doing through this period for online shopping products. Products can't move without having a container to have them put inside. Now, this business is a completely different business. It's a business that provides services to people with disability in Australia, and I'm sorry, I'm turning sideways, and that's just to check our time. The Lifestyle Solutions and a different union, the Australian Services Union, have collaborated to transform the organisation to meet a new public policy that was determined for Australia to support people with disability, called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And that policy completely turns on its head the way in which disability organisations are funded, from a supply side model to a demand side model. And in that sense, the organisations are having to be much more responsive to customers. And this organisation's working to literally turn on its head the management structure, such that all work that is done also contains decision making. The theorists will know this as socio-technical systems or open systems theory, and that's been applied in this organisation with the collaborative support of the workforce through its union, and hence the quote on the bottom left-hand side of the screen around how the union and the organisation will work together. And our role in both of these examples is to be facilitative, genuinely facilitative, and to provide, at best, in terms of our intervention, coaching and mentoring, and sometimes just to actually create a space and step back and let the parties themselves work through the model of engagement that they're going to undertake. Joel, I think I will pass back to you.
So thank you, Anna. Anna has had the day-to-day task of leading this internal institutional change within the agency. Periodically, once or twice a year, I've had the honor of coming down and running workshops jointly with Anna. These are just covers of some of them, in which we sometimes would take the members through the principles of interest-based bargaining. Sometimes we would bring parties in and take them through practitioner workshops or master classes. We would explain high performance work systems, issues of new technology and what have you. Hidden behind these slides is actually a kind of fun thing that we did on a dinner one time with the members after their training, in which we had them write true and false stories about things that they encountered with new approaches. And people had to guess which stories were true and which ones were made up. And I will tell you that they were some very creative stories, but real life was actually stranger than truth more often than not. And so the point of this is that—
Just do a wrap up in 1 minute.
A substantial investment has been made in institutional capability. And this is our last slide in terms of the results. Anna?
Yeah, so in the 40 seconds that my timer says we have left, Harry, I just want to be optimistic and hopeful about the future, because in Australia for the last 20 years we've had a huge divide, not just industrially, which is a legacy, but also politically. And suddenly, out of COVID, you see our Attorney General there on the left and our Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, our national peak union body on the right. And they are meeting, and their colleagues now meeting in fact 5 working groups to look at the future of industrial relations in Australia. And that's the first, that's a green shoot, little green shoot, excuse me as they stop, of tripartism that has literally not occurred in Australia for 20 years. And whilst the impetus has been COVID and the need to work together to overcome it, the instinct was to unite, the instinct was to collaborate, the instinct was to problem solve, and that's exactly the instinct that we're trying to draw upon in the institutional work we're doing, and I'm hoping that there will be cooperation beyond the crisis.
Great, thanks much, both of you, and also to Johanna and Mark, who did a lot of the related work you're drawing on. So let me just again invite 1 or 2 short questions, but again, not allow Anna or Joel to respond yet, but if you really have to get something off your chest, feel free to contact Natalia through the chat function or shout out if you choose that vehicle. Okay, time's up. So let's move on. We have 2 other interesting papers to get to, and also to allow some time at the end for questions for any of the 4 presentations. It's now my pleasure to invite John Budd from the University of Minnesota and Ryan Lamare from the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to talk about their work on the importance of political systems. And I don't know which order John and Ryan are going to choose to present, but I'll turn it over to them.
Yeah, thanks very much, Harry. So I'll be taking on the presentation duties today. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for attending. We welcome any feedback from both the theoretical perspective that we're going to introduce today, and also some of the empirical results as well. And just note we had a very small change to the title also, but the substance of our presentation will be very similar to what was on your panel program. So the first thing that I want to start with is a sort of acknowledgement that both scholars and practitioners have for a long time recognized the value of the intersections between IR, politics, and the state. So this is very common, but what's been less well established by this sort of strand of research is the effects of a country's political system on industrial relations. So we're going to look at 2 components of political systems here. We're going to look at the electoral system of a country, which we're going to break into 2 subcomponent parts, and we're going to look at the presence or absence of multi-party coalitions. And we're going to make some theoretical arguments that these political systems affect industrial relations in the form of union membership, coverage of union members, and the influence of unions as well. how we're going to think about this is by looking at the way in which political systems can help shape preferences for social partnership from political parties, and also preferences within the workplace for partnership. And we're also going to look at this by trying to make an argument that political systems can help create certain types of values or certain attitudes or attitudinal spillovers that shape models of behavior that are going to move from the sort of political dimension or sphere into the workplace dimension or sphere. And we're going to try and place political systems alongside really standard sort of IR institutional arrangements, like things like the ideological position of a party, the variety of capitalism, the Ghent system for unemployment insurance, all these sort of drivers of union membership at the sort of political and political economy level. We think that what's missing is a sort of structural understanding of the political system under which firms and employees are operating. So how are we going to sort of look at this? We're going to look at these connections between the theoretical linkages between political systems and IR by looking at 3 different empirical data points. We're going to look at European company survey establishment level data across 2 waves from 2009 and 2013. And we're going to capture the presence or absence of trade unions and collective wage agreements in that data and look at what explains the presence or absence of those things. We're also going to look at 1 round of the European Social Survey from 2010 and 24 countries within the ESS to look at not only union presence or absence, but also the influence of unions on a workplace, and again, whether political systems can help explain those 2 factors. And the third thing is we're going to look at all 8 full rounds, a pooled sample of European Social Survey data, which is 145,000 individual workers, and look at union membership, and again, looking at whether political systems affect that. So before I get into the sort of theory, I thought it might be useful for us, John and I thought it would be useful for us to sort of explain what the parameters are. These measures are borrowed from political science, and so they may be somewhat unfamiliar to IR scholars. And we want to just sort of talk about what we're thinking about here so that you can understand it better. So the political science literature looking at comparative electoral systems in particular tends to break those electoral systems down into 2 major subcomponents. The first is the effective number of political parties within a system. And that can be thought of as a measure of 2 different sort of contrasting ideas. One is the level of representativeness or multipartism within a system or country. And the second could be the level of competitiveness or fragmentation within a country. So you can think about effective number of parties as having sort of 2 different normative elements to them. The second is the disproportionality of the electoral system. The disproportionality of the electoral system is based on the relationship between the translation between the number of parties, number of votes a party receives to the actual seats that the party holds in an election. So disproportionality is basically the extent to which vote share translates into seat share. Higher disproportionality is a less conveys a less representative legislative body. Just a quick example of this would be like in the UK. In the 2019 election in the UK, the Conservative Party received 44% of the vote, but 56% of the seat share. Liberal Democrats in the UK in 2019 got 11% of the vote share, but only got 1.7% of the seats. So this is quite a disproportionate allocation of votes to seats. The third thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at the presence or absence of coalitions. So that's a straightforward measure of whether the government in power was part of a ruling coalition or whether it ruled on its own. Okay, so let me just run through a little bit of the theory here. What are our expectations theoretically? The expectation is that More pluralistic and more inclusive political systems should yield stronger levels of workplace pluralism, and that should translate into higher levels of union membership and influence within a political economy. Why do we think this is going to be the case? Well, the first thing that you might think is that the story could be purely ideological. If you have ideologically left-leaning parties in power, for instance, they might also push for stronger union protections, which leads to stronger union influence. We're going to try and tell a story that goes beyond ideology. It will account for ideology, we will control for ideology, but we'll try and move beyond ideology to look more at these structures of a political system. Is there something structurally about the system that can affect union membership and influence? So here's several sort of ways in which we think that could happen. One is that under coalitional systems, we anticipate that unions are likely to be brought in as consensus builders within these political systems. In a coalitional system, there's a much stronger likelihood that you're going to have policy deadlocks. You get a coalition in power, they can't agree on a policy. Quite frequently, what coalitional systems will do is they'll turn to unions to try and help negotiate consensus-based policies. No matter the ideology of the ruling coalition, they can frequently use their structures to turn to unions to help resolve this. This gives unions legitimacy, lets unions act as consensus builders, and we think that may spill over into increased legitimacy of unions in the workplace. A second theoretical channel is that quite frequently employers, businesses, rely on social partners and rely on needing to work with these partners under more proportional and representative systems to enact policies that they're interested in passing. Under a disproportionate system or under a system where you have sort of one party that you can speak to, business interests can be subsumed within a single party's identity. For instance, the business interests being subsumed within the Republican Party identity within the US, and therefore businesses don't need to reach out to other groups to try and enact the policies that they're interested in. Under more proportional systems, there's that requirement that businesses have to sort of engage with and therefore potentially legitimize the voice of unions. The third theoretical channel is the idea of a culture of compromise that can develop out of a political system. If you have a more representative system, quite frequently, if a government wants to enact an unpopular reform, they can sort of hide behind the more representative agents within the system and say, look, it's not just me that's trying to enact this unpopular reform, it's also these social partners that I've invited into the decision-making process, and therefore you can't blame me completely, and so I'm not going to be totally accountable for sort of enacting an unpopular reform. That requires that a government builds a culture of consensus between itself and other partners, particularly employers and unions. So if that again spills down into the workplace, then we expect that more consensus-based coalitional government or governments that can sort of shield accountability to voters are going to also have stronger union influence. Finally, a couple of other quick points. Theoretically, if you have simply more union members or union-backed parties in the legislature, structurally, we think that gives greater opportunities for unions to have a voice in governance and also a voice to retort any rhetorical or policy-based attacks on unions. They can speak up in the political process and therefore protect unions in the workplace. And also, if you have a more diverse legislature, you simply get more diverse policies, some of which are likely to be union favorable. So how are we going to test this? Oh, I should also note, this is true for disproportionality, likely for disproportionality and for coalition governance. It's less clear that that's true for effective number of parties. Effective number of parties could, if they represent competitive fragmentation, we may actually see that political systems can increase fragmentation and extremism, and therefore we're going to have weaker theorizing around the effective number of parties than we do around disproportionality or coalition governance. Okay, so how are we going to test this? We're going to look at establishment level data. As I mentioned, we're going to look at European company survey data. And in this data set, we have indicators of in this data set, we have indicators of union representation and collective wage agreements. We also have a huge number of organizational and employer characteristics. We account for varieties of capitalism. We account for legislative ideology and coalition-based ideology. And what we do is we map the electoral systems onto this establishment level data. So here's the first set of findings that I'd like to show you. This is from the ECS. You have 2009 and 2013 union representation and collective wage agreements, and you see disproportionality is significant, highly significant, and negative across all the waves and all the measures. This seems to suggest that disproportionality, so as proportionality decreases, as disproportionality increases, union representation and collective wage agreements decline. Now, I should note that this is not including Ghent systems. If you include Ghent systems, actually, then only effective number of parties, which is also negative, remains. But I highlight that here because this is the only case in which Ghent systems wipes out those findings. So these results will be robust to additional permutations with Ghent included, although in ECS, Ghent knocks out disproportionality, but effective number of parties remains. So just the effective number of parties findings indicate that as you have greater numbers of parties within a political system, union influence actually declines, at least according to the ECS. And finally, the results for coalition governance are a little bit more mixed, although we get in 2013 negative effects, although in 2009 positive. But again, that gets wiped out by Ghent. Okay, the next data that I want to show you is individual level data. This is the European Social Survey. I'm going to show you two waves. The first is round 5, which was conducted in 2010. 24 countries that we're going to have in our data, and we're going to look at 20,000 workers. And we're going to be able to look at two measures, which is the presence of unions and also their influence. And we're going to account for a bunch of demographic characteristics, a bunch of employer characteristics. We'll merge electoral systems into this model, and we'll control again for legislative coalitional ideology, varieties of capitalism, et cetera. So when we look at round 5 of the ESS, if you look at the union members in the workplace measure, again, we get very strong negative effects of disproportionality on union membership, and also strong negative effects of disproportionality on union influence. Again, similar patterns for effective number of parties, negative strong effects, and a little bit mixed on coalitions, but generally a positive effect of coalition governance on at least union influence. And again, this is robust to the inclusion of Ghent systems as well as all the other measures that I mentioned. Last one I want to show you is the European Social Survey pooled, which is going to run from 2002 to 2016. We only have one measure we can look at here, which is union membership, not influence. That's why it's sort of the last thing we show you. But again, we have all the same controls, and we can look across 8 different waves of the data and 31 different countries. So here I'm going to show you two things. The first, column 2 here, includes all measures except it doesn't include country fixed effects. And again, we see the exact same pattern following the previous results. Column 3 actually includes country fixed effects, and this is the most restrictive model that only looks at within country variation in union membership and within country variation in political systems parameters. But again, we see very strong, similar, almost identical effects, just maybe slightly less materially significant, but or I should say slightly less significant in the magnitude, but still significant in the statistical power. Okay, so two things that I just want to close with.
You got a minute. You got a minute to close.
No problem. Thanks. I'll just wrap up now. One thing we don't believe that reverse causality is probably causing is driving this. We don't anticipate that unions are affecting the electoral systems. We believe it goes the opposite way because we don't really see any evidence of unions trying to reshape electoral systems in our data during the time period. Just to get to the implications and discussion. So what we find is that we think that there's a missing story story here with our results that hasn't been told yet. And that story seems to say that, you know, unions can gain a lot of power by trying to move beyond a legislative agenda that just looks at labor standards and actually includes a legislative agenda that potentially seeks to support political systems reforms. And so that's our expectation. We need to, I think, consider this more deeply and consider that electoral and political systems can deeply affect union membership and influence. Sorry for running a little bit over, but I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Okay, great. Mark Bray raised a question. Mark, do you want to ask it, or do you want Natalia or me to summarize it? It's about legitimacy.
Hey, for you to do it, Harry.
Well, it's really just, it's about the question of legitimacy. Again, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay, it just struck me that in each of the propositions that was on the screens, the word legitimacy came up. So I'm just wondering whether there's a more basic issue about union membership being higher where the legitimacy of unions are higher, and whether that's been measured in an empirical way.
Okay, great. Now, again, I'm not going to allow Ryan or John to respond. John also had a comment about other matters in the chat if you want to look at. Does anyone else have a short question they want to raise? Hannah, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So my question is, if I'm a trade union leader, which for any Australian watching, I realise I'm not, but if I'm a trade union leader, do I orient my energy of my union towards creating this this political system which is favourable towards my existence? Is that part of my effort that I make as part of my strategic intent? Or is it appropriate to remain investing in grassroots and creating my legitimacy in workplaces through traditional organising methods? Or perhaps is it both?
Okay, great. Thanks, Ryan, for presenting, and also to John for co-authoring. So let me move on to our fourth paper to be presented by Peter Norlander, sole author of this paper. Peter's from Loyola University of Chicago, and his paper is about growing divergence of employment relations. And as someone who's written a book that's got a divergence in the title, I'm of course curious about what Peter thinks. So I'll turn it over to him now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is an honor to be in front of so many esteemed scholars, and certainly that title was on my mind as I was putting together thoughts for what this piece is. If you Google the title, you can find a copy of the working paper that is now published as a chapter in the book on international and comparative employment relations, and a need for the role of translation. So I was looking at the United States in this book chapter, and this will not be anything new, I think, for those of you who are very familiar with the United States or with the work that has been done. But I want to just background and motivate what has happened in the United States in terms of the decline of the stable industrial relations, the long-standing existence of a two-tiered wage system, and the growing interest in supply chain fissuring. These are major trends in the United States. We also see that within the country, within countries around the world, there's increased variation. So the United States is maybe a good example for an international conference, and following the last paper where we heard about the impact of electoral and political systems. Here we have a framework of common laws and common language or political system, but yet the feeling that I've had, and I'm looking since 2000, that's also the experience that I've lived through very much, is that it's a period of growing divergence. Seems like there's more instability and more fragmentation. So even if you look, even if you look at and talk to a human resources person who is in Silicon Valley, well, are you speaking with someone in people operations? If it's someone who works at a bank, are you speaking with someone who's a human capital analyst? You know, the fragmentation of the system by industry, and then I'm going to talk mostly here about what the chapter is looking at in terms of the policies. And the key takeaway is not to note the details here, but the big picture of instability, power politics, and ideology. So I'm going to show some data, very fragmentary, or very, I'm sorry, preliminary, but very just illustrative of what I'm seeing here as a growing divergence in the United States. And what I see as ideologically driven divergence here. So arguably you could, you know, bucket the left group into states that are emphasizing issues of equity, workers' rights, and voice, and where workers may have more power, more workers are unionized. And on the right, you have efficiency leaning states, and I do mean in that sense, you know, focusing on employer profitability there, and firms have more power in those states. So I'm going to give this example. The key takeaway in the examples I'm giving is that there's a policy in the United States. The policy has major exemptions. Whatever area we may talk about, we can do that. The exemptions will have exceptions. The policies will be reversed. The reversals will be reversed. The issue here is really one of instability. So take employment at will, where employees can, employers can change the terms and working conditions of work at any time for any reason, can hire or fire. Well, of course, there are major exceptions to this doctrine. One area is labor law, for example, and employees are protected under labor law. But if we just take a simple question, who is an employee? It seems, you know, the National Labor Relations Board has reversed itself on this. So at the national level, there isn't a consistent answer for private universities. Now for public institutions, some states say yes, some states say no. Okay, so you have a national system and you have state level policy as well. If we look at national policy again on overtime, for example, in the Obama administration, there was a major effort. You have workers who receive overtime pay, right? But there are exemptions for overtime pay, managers, certain professions. Well, the Obama administration was going to make it so that many more workers would be eligible for overtime to eliminate some of those exceptions to the exemptions. Well, that was held up in court, and then the Trump administration came in, they reversed the policy, and they wrote a new rule that does elevate some workers to receive overtime pay. But the reversals here we see happening as well. There are more examples of this in just the last month. And there's a good example here of how the role of the Supreme Court in setting national policy has been elevated because our Congress has not really produced much legislation in these areas. For workers who are gay, lesbian, transgender, they were not protected prior to a month ago or a week ago in the United States. Now they are protected under the employment discrimination laws. And the Supreme Court made this ruling. But you had state level action happening where some states were protecting workers and other states were not. So I just want to share with you quickly the data that I looked at. I'm borrowing here from a political scientist who looked at polarization in the states and the idea basically of tracking how left or how right is a state moving on a number of metrics. So I looked at, you know, which states have right to work laws, which states changed their policies, which states on the liberal side, you know, were raising minimum wages, increasing local wage and hour law enforcement, reclassifying independent contractors, and so forth. So we have measures that I gathered from a variety of sources. I searched employment trackers at the state level from Bloomberg BNA, the Department of Labor, National Association of State Legislatures, advocacy tanks and advocacy groups and think tanks. And there's one figure here that I can show you that I think tells the story here. So these are the measures that I came up with. And what I did is you get a +1 if you add one of these right-leaning policies, and you get a -1 if you add one of these left-leaning policies. And so the index is going to show you the change in the state since 2000. And here's the picture. And this tells the story. So the states that began in the year 2000 as kind of to the right, and the state that began in 2000 kind of to the left, they've expanded that difference. And so where we are in 2016, this is when I had the data, is more divergent than in the year 2000. So that sums up my presentation and the paper, and I really wrote it to give it to my students to make them think about the role of ideology in politics and how, when we talk about the United States, sometimes we need to be careful. Well, which part of the United States are we talking about and what applies in what area? So I look forward to any comments and questions, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to go in reverse order and say that you can now ask questions of Peter, and I'm going to allow Peter to respond. And let's just do it by seeing if there are a couple of questions. I always like that kind of style rather than have just one question about his work. So do we have any questions we can accumulate about Peter's work? And then I'll let him respond if we have a couple of questions.
John, you can go ahead. Just remember to unmute yourself.
Good point.
Just a comment. Presentations like this make it more and more difficult for me to do my comparative course. Can't you rig the data some way? So, because I stand in my course and I talk about the US, and I'm just aware increasingly of how difficult it is to generalize. I think that presentation does a good job of showing it.
So let me just add, my own question would be, and then I'll let Mark turn, is kind of what explains the divergence? You know, why is there greater divergence? I agree with you. I think there is greater divergence. I had similar thoughts, although I didn't have the substantial data that you have to back it up. And I don't have a great explanation for it. There's polarization. And so I throw that in. Let me also turn it over to Mark and any others that want to ask a question of Peter, and then we'll let Peter respond.
Harry, you just took my word, polarization or partisanship. Seems to me that, especially that last slide about the different states in the US and how they're shifting in two different directions and going further away from each other. The key issue there is not so much diversity as polarization or increasing partisanship, which in some ways you've seen over recent years in Australia. But Anna is suggesting that recent events have started to put a dent in that polarization, and maybe the parties are cooperating and coming a little bit more close together. That remains to be seen in Australia, I think, but I wonder if they're better words or concepts rather than diversity.
Any other questions?
This is
Peter?
Joel. I'll ask one more quick question that's building on the same theme, which is that in the COVID crisis, we see coalitions of governors and coalitions of mayors emerging. And in fact, with the Paris Climate Accord, when Trump said he was going to pull out, 350 mayors a month later said they're still in. And so I also wonder whether the appropriate unit of analysis isn't the country level, but whether we'll see emergent collaborative institutions that are at the sort of state or even city level that will have a life of their own going forward.
Okay, so Peter, feel free to respond to any of the questions you wish, and then I'll let David Lewin ask another question. But Peter, go ahead.
Thank you. I definitely believe polarization, you know, red-blue states is a big part of this. I think, you know, to be a little more abstract, the comparative political economy and advantage arguments about varieties of capitalism may apply within a nation. So there may be regions, states, industries where they are on a, you know, skills investment path. They want to develop their workforce, and they're gonna, you know, make investments differently, and they're gonna make choices and policies differently than states that may be more resource-based on, you know, natural resources or, you know, other low-wage labor systems. So I haven't thought that through fully. I think in terms of being difficult to teach a single, you know, concept about the United States, I sympathize and agree. It's interesting to see the emergence of regional institutions too, yes.
Okay, I noticed a chat question from David, if he wishes to ask it, or one of us could read it. If he'd
Well, sure, I'll ask it if you want me to.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I really appreciate this session and the presentations, beginning with John Godard. Peter, two developments I wanted to ask you about in terms of the application of labor law. One is, and I think it dates to the 1980s, when continuous or permanent employment began to decline greatly. We've had the rise, then rather slowly, but in this century so far, in 2 decades, quite rapidly, of independent contracting. And so many labor services aren't, at least technically, provided by employees, and thus labor law does not appear to cover them. So I wonder if you have a comment about that. And relatedly, we've seen, especially in this century so far, the rise of franchising arrangements in which the question of who exactly is the employer, are there two of them, the franchisor and the franchisee, or just one of them, also tends to not be something that traditional labor law has addressed, even though the NLRB has gotten into this action quite a lot, as you know. I wonder if you have any comments about both of these, one or the other or both of these developments.
So let me let Peter respond to that, and then we're going to move on to see if there's questions for the Bud and Lamare paper. Go ahead, Peter.
2 decades ago, the issue of subcontracting was emerging, and let's just say, for argument's sake, it was on the national agenda for labor and employment policy. Now it's on the agenda for state level employment policy, and states are taking a lead where the federal government has not acted. So that may be also a change of political strategies among unions and actors in the employment relationship who are, pushing at the city and state level where, previously they had a hope for federal action. I hope that I think the rise of these types of arrangements, some states we see divergence there. And if I do this tracker again in another 10 years, there are issues that are just starting to emerge and issues that haven't yet emerged that will increase the divergence. And so, for example, salary history bans. Just in the last couple of years, some states are banning employers from asking prospective employees about their salary history. So it's going to keep changing, is what I see.
Yeah, so your first part of your answer reminds me of the approach to COVID in this country. The states are in the game.
Yeah. Great point. Okay, I want to give everyone a chance. So let's see if there are questions for Bud and Lamare. Maybe I'll toss one out, and then I'll let others add in, and we'll accumulate some questions before we give Ryan and John a chance. And that is there some deeper logic to this pattern? What is it that leads to the relationships that you've identified? Is it just kind of almost accidental that certain political systems lead to stronger unions and stronger or better workplace outcomes, or more influence of the unions is the way you measure it? Or so is there something else that really ties it all together, or is it just kind of an interesting set of relationships? And then one could talk about how unions should, as you do at the end, should go ahead and see that connection and go ahead and try and promote it. So that's my question. I'll just see if others have questions for Ryan and John, and then let them respond. Joel, go ahead.
I'll sort of piggyback.
Joel, just you should unmute yourself.
Okay, I did. Harry, I'll piggyback on your question, which is, in terms of the underlying mechanisms that are going on, it would be nice to now peel back these cases with some smoking guns in terms of, were there policy changes that you can trace across the times as kind of an event history, or other things that you can point to? I don't think it's just sort of an abstract climate story. I think that there are institutional stories. The Australia case is one where it seems to be shifting in the other direction. And the prediction would be that union density would then grow in an environment where they have this full joint partner status. But it would be nice to then unpack these quantitative data with the institutional stories behind them.
All right, let me just see if there's one or two other questions for Ryan and John.
I put my hand up, Harry, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Go, Mark.
I think there is an intriguing set of measurement issues and trying to establish whether there's an empirical relationship between union membership and influence and those other factors. But once you start to try and explain anything that you discover through that process, one of the issues, and it's especially relevant to Australia, is the extent to which there's an external threat. In many ways, both at the enterprise level in the case studies we've done of new approaches, and also the national level in terms of the COVID crisis, there's this really strong external pressure or influence that's forcing the parties together internally. And I wonder whether the greater cooperation or the greater union membership or the greater legitimacy of unions will continue after the crisis expires.
So I think that's enough for now, but we'll see if there's other questions for John and Ryan after I now allow them to respond in any way they see fit and in any order they choose.
Okay, I'll start and then maybe Ryan.
Sorry, John, just before you go, I'm gonna have to cut you off. I think John also has a question. He has his hand raised. John, do you have a question?
Yes, just a quick question. The story that Ryan, I think that's a brilliant piece of research, but I have a friend who's a historical sociologist, and he would say it was all about power resource theory. Have you considered those sorts of analyses? I think Mark made a similar point. That these systems develop over the course of history. And for example, in places like Sweden, they had the Saltsbaden Agreement in 1938, which was because labor had a lot of power. And I just wonder if that figures into the story as well. You might want to put a historical dimension on it.
Okay, John, go ahead.
Okay, so for John's, he said brilliant, and then I sort of, just basked in that and tuned the rest of it out. But a little more seriously, I mean, tying that to Joel's, I think, yeah, I mean, right. I mean, I don't think Ryan or I would disagree with any of this, and digging more into mechanisms, digging more into history, things like that. But in terms of the research process, it's sort of a chicken and egg. I think if we had started there, you'd say, oh, you're just picking sort of random thing A and random thing B and try, you've picked out the one idiosyncratic example. Why should we believe this as a wider phenomenon? And so we sort of happened along this at a more comparative level. And so, in fact, we were pretty cynical about the results we were discovering. And so we tried to sort of do everything to sort of beat it down. And that's why we have multiple data sets and different dependent variables and stuff. And so, yeah, so we wouldn't disagree. We just hope that, it doesn't detract from brilliance, some people have said, of the current paper. And then, we'll leave some of this for other research. In terms of the bigger story, we do see it, and again, fully recognizing Joel's and other points in terms of, not directly observing any of these underlying mechanisms, but, we tend to see theoretically, conceptually, and drawing on some, small examples that we talk about briefly in the paper, not in any detail. We see the picture as around a climate of inclusion and respect for diverse voices and things of that nature, and that could operate in different ways. But we see that as the big picture story. Earlier, Mark,
John, if I could, before you go on, just to be clear, the comment isn't a critique of the paper. I think the paper is a great analysis and it's important. It's more that I think it's possible that the forces that are driving the political systems to fragment may or may not be the same forces that are driving unions to grow or shrink. And so in fact, there could be forces that are at play that are helping unions to grow that are independent of the political dynamics, or they could be piling up and having an additive effect. And so that's really what the unpacking might do, because if there multiple concurrent different dynamics at play, then it's a story of which forces are stronger versus are all these things aligned and in a sense loading on the same effect. But where you went with this, I think, was the exact right place to start. And now the question is, how do we unpack the mechanisms?
Yeah, and you know, being trained as an economist, you know, when I, you know, the words I hear when you're giving your comment is, you know, endogeneity or reverse causality or whatever, admitted variable bias. And so, you know, econometrically, we've tried to deal with those things, but yeah, some serious qualitative research could help sort of dig into those things as well. You know, and this connects to, I think, Mark's second question too, in that we want to be really clear in that, you know, we're not setting this up as a competitive story, right? That, you know, we've discovered this new mechanism that's more important than, you know, these other pressures that bring parties together or other types of things, right? I mean, we very much want to put this forth as an additional factor that we don't think has gotten the recognition that it should, but we're certainly not making any arguments that this is, you know, more important than some other things that might be going on, or things of that nature. Just quickly, Mark asked about legitimacy, and you know, if we take that sort of in loose terms rather than very narrow terms as a construct, you know, we see it more around, you know, positive attitudes or lack of anti-union attitudes, and I think the U.S. research, you know, supports that. Workers are more likely to join, workers are more likely to support unions when they're positive, when they sort of have general positive attitudes towards unions, among other factors as well, of course. And then Anna asked about, you know, should union leaders be trying to raise legitimacy through the political system or in the workplace? And then she ended with both, which of course is where we would go. Again, we don't see this as an argument by any means that this is more important in terms of building legitimacy than things you could do in the workplace. But maybe there's sort of, you know, different levels, and it's probably not worth it for shop stewards to spend their time on this, but maybe, you know, at peak level labor organizations, and see it more as a project of the labor movement rather than shop stewards on the ground.
Okay, I'm going to move on to make sure everyone has their fair share of time for questions, and move on to Joel and Anna's presentation and see if anyone has questions for them.
I'll repeat my question if that's okay, which is really, what do you see as having been the effects of the New Approaches program so far? Anna's initial response on chat was that it was previously fairly narrowly based in particular enterprises, but recent events have suggested that maybe that's having the impact on the parties at national policy level. Do you want to expand on that, Anna, or are there any other issues around that?
And then let me add a question that Matt Fisher-Daly has offered as well, added in it, which is kind of what do you think about the lasting effects of this? You know, we've seen lots of examples of integrative, Joel knows that well, integrative problem-solving approaches for a while that don't last. And do you think there is something now going on, maybe prompted by the pandemic and all, that is truly getting institutionalized?
Yeah.
And then let me see if there's one other question that anyone may have, and then I'll turn it over to Anna and Joel. I do want to allow time for questions of John Goddard. Okay, that's a long pause. So go ahead, Joel or Anna, whoever wants to go first.
I'll say a couple of things, and I very much enjoy hearing what Joel's got to say. This is entirely speculative. Actually, even though personality-wise I'm an optimist, on this I am a pessimist. I like to think that, and I have some personal knowledge that I can't really share with you, of course, but I do think that some of the individuals concerned in the current emergent cooperative wave at the political level have been personally influenced by experience and have figured out this one little thing which I think is pretty important, and that is that we can actually have constructive dialogue across groups with quite deeply divided interests, because there's always something we can agree upon, and it's better to actually promote the thing we can agree on and remain respectively divergent on those matters we can't, than to not come together at all and never speak at all and not achieve that one thing that we can agree on. So I don't have actually a huge optimism for the output of the current political process, although I think that some small benefits, some small improvements in our system can be attained. In terms of the enterprise workplace level, my experience both in Australia and also observing the US experience in particular with groups like Kaiser Permanente, you'd have to ask yourself the question, you know, if there's going to be a generalisation and others looking towards a successful model and saying that's a fantastic way to work together, how can we do that? You would think that every part of the American health system would be mimicking Kaiser Permanente, but they're not. Similarly, we have huge competitors to a number of our new approaches, files or parties together in Australia who can absolutely see what's happening in those workplaces, but they're not climbing across and saying, please, can we learn? Can we come and do benchmarking tours? Can we come and talk to your people? What is this magic? There's actually, you know, they kind of revel in their unilateralism and in their forcefulness, strong arm, or somebody called it on a Zoom yesterday, a stiff arm approach to unions on the part of management. So, you know, whilst I always look for little glimmers of hope and like to talk about them, because I think sometimes the stories we tell create our reality, I'm not truly a Pollyanna about this.
So Joel, in 30 seconds or less, because I do want to allow time.
In 1978, when the National Labor Management Cooperation Act was debated in Congress in the United States, one of the senators asked, if this is such a good idea, why isn't everyone doing it? And that question has persisted all throughout these experiments. And my takeaway from it is that most of the legislation is around mitigating harm, because there are folks who are taking adversarial and contentious approaches, and people say there ought to be rules of the game. I think at a governance level, it really suggests that there might need to be two-track systems, where folks who are prepared to be in a cooperative and other track have the institutional supports and the ability to do so, and folks who are essentially creating external cost to society through adversarial processes are governed in a different way, because it is a logic of cooperation that prevails time and time again.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off because I do want to allow time for questions for John Goddard's interesting paper. I'm going to start it by asking a question. It seems to me, John, that you see the glass as half empty, and I would say there's many reasons to think the glass is half full with regard to how the field of industrialization is evolving. I remember back when I was younger, joking with some of my PhD students who happened to have worked and then were about my age, Mike Belzer and Jeff Keefe, were my students when I started out at Cornell, and we would joke about whether or not we were the last generation of people in the field of industrial relations. And I think there's been a lot of incredible healthy development represented by many of the people in this session and many of the other sessions, incredible work in comparative, incredibly broader notion of what collective action, collective representation means beyond just unionism. Use, as John and Ryan do, concepts in political science and sociology and kind of a healthier interaction. Anyway, aren't there many things that are quite healthy in our field? I'll stop at that and see if others have one or two questions, and then we'll turn it back to you, John.
You want me to answer now?
I
I'm going to just see if there's one or two other questions. Yeah, just going to see if there's one or two. Natalia, are there other questions that I'm missing that are posted? Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, John and Peter afterwards.
Okay, thanks. So John, in your desire for debate, you know, not to die on the efficiency hill, but just for in the spirit of debate, if we go back to efficiency, and, you know, I would define it in more idealistic terms, just in terms of thinking about effective use of scarce resources. And so in the spirit of, you know, looking for real institutions to deliver on the democratic principles, suppose we had different organizational forms and we could evaluate them against these democratic principles. But what happens if the organizational form that does best in terms of delivering these democratic principles, right, is highly inefficient in terms of, you know, not producing the things that society wants and needs, not in a materialist way, but in a more idealistic way. Right? I mean, that doesn't seem very good for the environment in terms of sustainability or other types of things. So, so would we completely throw out efficiency, or how would we work that into the calculus?
Okay, Peter, your question, and then we'll turn it over to John.
Just in terms of the post-materialist concept, I just wanted your reaction to the idea that, you know, there's so much at stake here in terms of financial resources as well, inequality, and you know, those in money, in material resources, matters greatly to people and historically in the field. And just a reaction to that thought.
Okay, John, it's yours.
Okay, I'll start out with Anna's original question about the decent work, ILO concept of decent work. I don't consider the principles that I'm identifying necessarily the final word, and I think that the decent work principles or statement are, you could almost substitute for it, although I would take a few issues with it. But you're quite right. I mean, my point isn't to identify certain principles as the final word, as it is to develop an alternative approach or a new direction in IR, which is oriented towards principles like those. Harry's half full, half empty. I don't know. I tend to be a, you know, a half empty type of guy. I mean, now you were an editor for a number of years, so maybe you didn't get jaded, but I was also an editor for a number of years of a journal, and I came out jaded. I came out saying, what's the point of all of this? And maybe that's where this paper comes from, is just the exhaustion of endless, no, they're not coming to get me, if you can hear that siren. Just hang on a second. They're not, I don't think they're coming to get me.
Hopefully John's not jumping out the window in his pessimism. Go ahead, John.
Questions first. If you see guys come in with a stretcher, you know why I didn't finish. But I just felt at the end of that there doesn't seem to be much kind of overall unifying point to the field. And part of my talking about moving from mountains of facts to a pointless forest is that there's lots of research out there that has a point, and there are research projects and groups of researchers that absolutely have a point, but we don't seem to have anything unifying the field. And that's the point of my paper, is not to diss a lot of the good work that's being done out there. It's just a matter of trying to come up with some sort of new point, and maybe just a new direction of research, I don't know. As for efficiency, no, John, you can't achieve the principles I'm talking about without reasonable efficiency. So in my paper, I argue that efficiency and property rights shouldn't be given equivalence, but they're constraints. And in fact, they can even facilitate the attainments of these principles. So I'm not arguing that not to worry about the economy. I'm arguing, though, that the idea that there's this exact trade-off which you get in pluralism is, to me, certainly under what I'm arguing for, I disagree with, okay? And as for Peter, material resources, yes, that's a weakness in what I'm arguing, although I think I did say that kind of the point is to have something which we're not going to have, universal notions of basic income and benefits. And I think that certainly in Canada, and I can't speak to the US at all here, the COVID crisis has really raised this question. of having a better set of kind of universal benefits in place and pay. And of course, issues of inequality still pertain, but those have implications for whether or not the principles I'm talking about are attained. So dignity isn't attained if you've got high inequality, if people are being discriminated against. And one of my principles is actually inequality also. So that's it's a bit of a fudge, right? I absolutely agree with it. When I started working on this, I thought we need something new. And so this is what came out, right? And it needs more work, and the same way that Wright's project needed more work and still does. But I think it's useful to think about the field and the world of work and in these kind of more utopian terms, and how we might get there, and how that might guide our research.
Great, thanks. I want to thank all the presenters for a really interesting session. I want to thank Natalia for helping us on the tech side, and I want to acknowledge and thank Johanna Westhoff for all the work she's done in preparing this conference, and she's been an active observer of this session. So thank you all, and I look forward to further interaction in this interesting conference. Take care. See you all.